A serene village in a small county nestled amidst sprawling farmlands and lush pine forests, the small village of Willow Creek in northern Wisconsin seemed like a slice of American paradise. With a population barely exceeding 600, it was the kind of place where everybody knew each other, where kids played baseball on dusty fields, and where neighbors shared backyard barbecues during long summer evenings. The air there always seemed fresher, cleaner, unpolluted by the rush and chaos of city life. Willow Creek was a living postcard of idyllic simplicity, a reflection of an old-fashioned America where a handshake still meant something, and gossip traveled faster than the local newspaper. Generations of hard-working families had built their lives in this tight-knit community, where time seemed to pass just a bit slower. Rustic houses with picket fences lined the narrow streets, and the centerpiece of the town was an ancient oak tree standing tall in the village square, believed to have been there since before the Civil War. The daily rhythm of life was marked by the sound of church bells ringing at noon, and evenings were graced with the hum of crickets and the occasional distant howl of coyotes. The people of Willow Creek lived lives of relative insulation from the rest of the world. The closest city, a modest one by modern standards, was over 40 miles away. The residents prided themselves on their self-reliance and cherished their sense of community. Main Street was home to just a few businesses, a diner where Betty Cramwell served the best peach cobbler for miles, a general store owned by the friendly but nosy Old Man Jenkins, and a one-room post office that doubled as a gathering point where townsfolk swapped stories, and the town mailman Greg cracked one bad joke after another. Life in Willow Creek had an understated charm that made it so special for the people who called it home. The simple joys were the heart of the town, a 4th of July parade where every family decorated their own floats, high school football games in the creaky old stands at the edge of town, nights spent under a vast, star-studded sky at the annual summer fair. It wasn't uncommon to walk into the local diner and find nearly the whole town gathered for coffee and pancakes on a Sunday morning after church. But what stood out the most about Willow Creek, something that made it more than just another scenic village on the map, was the sense of safety. The unshakable belief that the darkness of the world would never manage to creep into the borders of their little hamlet. People left their doors unlocked at night, children roamed freely on bicycles, their laughter filling the streets as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills in the distance. Violent crime was a stranger to Willow Creek. The biggest scandal in years involved Mr. Tucker's chickens mysteriously escaping and being found in a neighbor's garden. In fact, the local sheriff, Tom McAllister, often joked that his toughest job was pulling stray cats out of trees or mediating petty arguments over garden fences. It was here, in this pocket of tranquility and nostalgia, that a horrifying event would shake the town to its core. In a place like Willow Creek, where nothing bad could ever be imagined, let alone happen, the dark arrival of terror would mark the end of an innocence they had perhaps all taken for granted. The blood-soaked tragedy. It was a cold October morning when Deputy Hank Watterson received the call that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The voice on the other end wasn't panicked, as one might expect, but almost hollow, as though the caller themselves couldn't quite comprehend what they were reporting. There's been a murder," the woman had said, her voice trembling. "At the Larson place, all of them are gone." Willow Creek had never known trouble like this. Sure, there were the occasional disputes, arguments over property lines, gossip-fueled spats, even a fistfight or two at the annual summer fair, but a murder? A whole family? That was unheard of. By the time Hank drove his dusty patrol car up the gravel driveway to the Larson home, half the sheriff's department from the neighboring county was already there, standing around in grim clusters, their boots crunching on the frosted ground. The Larson residence, a sprawling farmhouse that had stood there for close to a century, seemed untouched from the outside. The windows were dark, the porch swings swayed faintly in the crisp autumn breeze, and the pumpkin decorations lining the stairs were still intact, as though no evil could ever touch this place. But inside was a different story. The blood was the first thing anyone noticed. It was everywhere, smeared across the floorboards, splattered on the wallpaper, pooling in the creaky gaps between the planks. It was the kind of sight that turned even the toughest officers pale. The 6 members of the Larson family, James Larson, his wife Margaret, their 3 children aged 7 to 16, and Margaret's elderly mother Martha, had all been brutally murdered. Each of them bore deep, slashing wounds that spoke to a killer consumed by rage or madness, or perhaps both. James was found in the kitchen, his body slumped over the table where coffee mugs and a half-eaten pie still sat, untouched. Margaret lay just a few feet away by the sink, her hands frozen as if she'd been fighting to protect her children. The two youngest Larson kids were still in their pajamas, curled up together in a corner of the living room, as though hiding from a nightmare that had come to life. Upstairs, the eldest daughter, Cassidy, was discovered sprawled across her bed, her blood-soaked diary open beside her, frozen mid-sentence. And then there was Martha, the grandmother, who was still sitting in her rocking chair beside the fireplace, where she always read her Bible before bed. Her glasses were cracked, and her frail body bore the same horrifying marks of violence as the rest of the family. It was clear this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing appeared to be stolen, and the sheer savagery of the attacks indicated something far more personal. The doors and windows hadn't been forced open, leading investigators to believe the Larsons might have known their attacker, or attackers. The clock in the hallway was broken, its hands frozen at 2:13 a.m., possibly marking the moment of the massacre. Every detail of the scene seethed with unanswered questions. Why the Larsons? They weren't just well-liked, they were practically the heart of the community. James ran the town's hardware store, always greeting customers with a wide grin and a refill of their coffee mugs from the ancient pot on the counter. Margaret was equally beloved, often organizing bake sales for the church or running fundraisers to fix the cracked bleachers at the high school football field. Even the kids were popular. Cassidy was the head of the cheerleading team, her younger siblings adored by teachers and classmates alike. And Martha was the town historian, the keeper of tales and traditions that stretched back to the founding of Willow Creek over 100 years ago. For a town so small, news spread quickly, and by dawn, nearly every resident had gathered outside the yellow perimeter tape, speaking in hushed tones and clutching their coats tightly against the morning chill. Betty Cramwell from the diner cried openly, mumbling something about how James had helped fix her roof last year. Old Man Jenkins stood at the edge of the crowd, muttering darkly that he'd seen this coming, though no one really paid him any mind. The Larsons' deaths weren't just a crime, they were a violation, a shattering blow to the very fabric of Willow Creek. Neighbors who once left their doors unlocked began installing bolts and chains. Parents who used to let their kids ride bikes until sunset now kept them indoors before it even got dark. The idyllic trust and warmth that had defined the village turned overnight into a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The sole survivor. Among the loss and devastation that gripped Willow Creek, there was one fragile, flickering ember of hope, a survivor. Emily Larson, the youngest member of the ill-fated family, was the only soul to make it out alive. But calling her a survivor doesn't fully capture the depth of her escape or the trauma etched into her every breath. Just 18 years old, Emily had barely stepped into adulthood when horror shattered her world, and now, she was all that remained of it. Emily was found the following morning in a daze, wandering barefoot along a dirt path that led into the dense forest behind her family's farmhouse. Her clothes were torn, smudged with dirt and stained with blood. Whether it was her own or from someone else, no one could immediately tell. She wasn't crying or screaming, in fact she wasn't making much sense at all. When a pair of hikers out for a morning walk stumbled upon her, she mumbled incoherent phrases like, "They came for us and I couldn't stop it," over and over again. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived to take her to the hospital, Emily was trembling so hard that the medic couldn't get a firm grip on her pulse. Her hands were clutching a small object, a frayed piece of ribbon that had once belonged to her older sister, Cassidy. She wouldn't let it go. "This is all I have left," she whispered hoarsely when asked about it, her voice barely audible. The doctors at the hospital confirmed that Emily had suffered no major physical injuries. A few scratches here and there, minor bruises on her arms and legs, and a large gash on her right forearm that appeared to be defensive, but psychologically and emotionally, she was shattered. They called it shock-induced mutism. She couldn't or wouldn't speak about what she had seen that night. What the authorities could piece together from the little she expressed was fragmented and deeply troubling. After hearing strange noises downstairs, Emily had woken up, sensing that something was very wrong. She tiptoed to her bedroom door and cracked it open just enough to see the shadows moving in the dim light from the living room. That's when she heard the first scream. Her mother's, cut short by what was unmistakably a violent act. Terrified, Emily grabbed the baseball bat leaning against her wall, the one her dad had placed there months ago, and lightheartedly referred to as just-in-case protection. She didn't run downstairs though. Fear paralyzed her in place. Her mind raced, trying to decide if she should confront the intruder, attempt to wake her grandmother and siblings, or, horrifyingly, save only herself. In that moment of agonizing indecision, the murderer began to ascend the staircase. The soft groan of the old wooden steps as they creaked under heavy footfall would stay with Emily forever. Realizing she couldn't fight off whoever or whatever was down there, Emily bolted for her bedroom window. It wasn't a graceful escape. She threw open the sash, climbed onto the sill, and hurled herself into the thicket below. The fall wasn't terribly far, but the brambles tore at her jeans and sliced shallow cuts across her arms. The baseball bat fell to the ground beside her, but she didn't pick it up. She only ran. Emily sprinted into the forest, her breathing ragged, heart pounding loud enough that she thought it might give her away. She could hear nothing behind her, but her imagination painted vivid scenarios of pursuit. Branches clawed at her, and somewhere along the way, one last sob of terror escaped her lips before she realized the importance of silence. She kept running until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the cold earth beneath towering pines. She curled up there, hidden, too afraid to move until the first light of dawn seeped through the canopy above. Once in the hospital's care, the detectives tasked with the case walked a fine line between comforting Emily and pressing her for details about what had happened. But every time they asked a direct question, her shoulders stiffened, and her terrified eyes darted to the nearest exit. She'd shake her head mechanically and barely mutter, "I don't know," over and over again. Locals speculated endlessly about why Emily had been spared. Theories ranged from her lucky escape through the window to something more sinister. "Maybe the killer let her go on purpose," some whispered in hushed tones over coffee at the diner. Others, their imaginations far darker, began imagining a twisted connection between Emily and the unseen murderer. Anything seemed possible to a town paralyzed by fear and confusion. Sheriff Tom McAllister defiantly insisted to the town that Emily was an innocent victim, not a suspect. "That girl has seen something no one should ever have to see," he told local reporters. "She's not a lead, she's a victim." Despite his firm statement, the rumors persisted. As days bled into weeks, Emily remained tucked away under medical surveillance with round-the-clock therapy sessions that showed little progress. The question on everyone's mind, what happened that night, was one Emily either could not or would not answer. Yet, in her silence remained the key to unraveling the ghastly mystery. Law enforcement believed Emily had witnessed details critical to identifying the assailant, even if she herself didn't consciously realize it. To lose her testimony meant losing the only insight into what had occurred within the blood-soaked walls of the Larson home. Deputies posted guards outside her hospital room. They weren't taking any chances. For Emily Larson, surviving was only the beginning. Rebuilding a life in the gaping chasm of grief and terror seemed impossible. How do you live when the world you knew has been reduced to ashes, and the ones you loved most have been torn away? Was she even safe now? Lying awake in her hospital bed each night, Emily couldn't banish the image of the shadows moving through her house, the shadows she barely escaped from, and that now moved freely, still out there, waiting. I hope this expanded section gives a visceral and emotional perspective on Emily's experience as the sole survivor. Her escape through the forest and the psychological aftermath were intense to write about, and I tried to capture the mix of fear, loss, and confusion she'd be going through. If you'd like, I can dive deeper into her relationships with her family, or explore how the town treats her as the investigation unfolds. What part would you like to focus on next? The shocking crime scene. The moment Deputy Hank Watterson stepped through the front door of the Larson farmhouse, the stifling odor of coppery blood hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes long after you'd left, that found its way up your nostrils, and settled there like a haunting memory, ready to resurface in your darkest nightmares. Hank wasn't new to crime scenes. He'd been at the sheriff's office for nearly 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for this. The living room was the first stop, and it was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The coffee table, once adorned with family photo albums and a weathered Bible, was riddled with bloody handprints. Overturned chairs told the tale of frantic attempts to escape, but the bodies of Margaret Larson and her youngest son Timmy told a different story. Margaret was sprawled on her back near the fireplace, her arms outstretched as if shielding someone. Blood had soaked through her once cheerful sunflower print blouse, pooling around her on the hardwood floor. Timmy, her 7-year-old, was crumpled nearby, his small frame eerily still. The streaks of blood across the floor suggested he'd tried crawling toward his mother before succumbing to his injuries. In the corner, a broken china cabinet stood as silent witness to the chaos. Shards of porcelain figurines lay scattered on the floor, flecked with dark spots of crimson. Margaret's wedding photo had been knocked from the mantel. Its cracked glass covered the smiling faces of a once happy family, now forever marred by the night's violence. The kitchen was worse, if that were even possible. James Larson, the patriarch of the family, was slumped forward onto the kitchen table. A mug of now-cold coffee sat untouched next to his slackened hand. A half-eaten slice of pecan pie sat abandoned, murder freezing the small moments of daily life in time's cruel grip. A streak of red ran down his back, staining the checkered tablecloth below. The kitchen window, facing out toward the barn, was wide open. A chilling autumn breeze blew in, clashing with the oppressive stillness inside. "God damn," muttered one of the deputies behind Hank, standing in the doorway with a handkerchief clutched over his nose. The horror escalated as Hank moved up the creaking staircase. Bloodied footprints marked the stairs, chilling evidence of someone. Could it have been the killer, or one of the victims desperately fleeing, making their way up in those final moments? The soft buzz of a dying light bulb in the hallway created an uneasy strobe across the gruesome scene. Cassidy's room was where Hank's throat tightened until it felt like he couldn't breathe. Cassidy, the Larsons' 16-year-old daughter, had been killed in her bed. The murder was as intimate as it was brutal. Her diary lay open beside her, its pages blotted with blood. She'd been writing when it happened, the pen still loosely clasped in her limp hand, frozen mid-word. Whatever she had been about to document, whatever precious insights into her life might have existed, they were now lost to the horror that had enveloped her. "Shut that door, please," one of the crime scene investigators whispered to Hank. Even though their role was to document every gory detail, even they weren't immune to the monstrous weight of staring directly at something no one should ever have to see. The final room on the tour of terror was Martha Larson's, a cozy chamber at the far end of the hall. Martha was the family matriarch, James's elderly mother, often seen knitting on her wooden rocker out by the porch. But her rocking chair this time had become her death chair. She had been found still seated, though not peacefully. Her hands gripped the armrests with a tension so severe it seemed like she was still trying to hold on, even after death. Glasses crooked, her Bible lay face down on the floor, open to a passage later identified as Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." She had been reading it daily for years to comfort her heart, but it hadn't saved her. The shock of the scene wasn't just in its violence, but in the sheer specificity. The killer hadn't rushed through this house. They had taken their time. There wasn't the chaos often associated with frenzied attacks. Everything about the crime felt deliberate, like it had been choreographed by a person with deep hatred or twisted intent. The indications of that intent were littered throughout the home. The clock in the hallway, struck with what appeared to be the same force used on the victims, had stopped at 2:13 a.m. Was that the precise time of the massacre, or was it a symbolic gesture from the killer? Handprints and bloody trails were everywhere, but oddly not a single forced door or window. The Larsons had known their attacker, or at least trusted them enough to let them inside. Out back, the barn stood ominously quiet under the morning sun. A few deputies ventured there while the rest combed the house. Inside, they found only the usual sights: sacks of feed, a pitchfork, and a collection of tools. But the loft held something strange. A small pile of cigarette butts and an empty liquor flask were stuffed into a corner, as if someone had been resting there recently. Deputy Watterson went back inside, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to process everything. "So what's missing?" Hank asked the lead investigator, Carl. Carl shrugged helplessly, scanning his clipboard. "That's the thing. It doesn't look like anything is. No valuables gone, no safe broken. Hell, even the jewelry on Margaret and Cassidy is still there. So it wasn't burglary? Doesn't seem that way, Hank." Carl flipped to another page in frustration. Someone came here to do this, to them. That family was targeted. As the forensics team worked, neighbors gathered just outside the yellow tape, their faces pale and drawn. The comforting sounds of Willow Creek, the rustling trees, distant tractors, even the chirping birds, seemed deafening in contrast to the horror behind closed doors. Betty from the diner couldn't stop shaking, clutching her coffee thermos like it was some kind of shield. Old Man Jenkins stood further back, muttering to anyone who would listen, "This town ain't seen evil like this before, never. Not since my granddaddy's time." Inside, Hank leaned against a wall, overwhelmed by the gravity of what had happened here. This wasn't just murder, this was annihilation, a monstrous act in a place where such things weren't supposed to happen. Whoever had done this had walked through Willow Creek's most sacred sense of safety and torn it to shreds. He tried to picture Emily Larson running through the woods, terrified and desperate, leaving behind this hellscape of blood and death. She had made it out, but what had she seen? What did she know? Her silence was heavy, but the house's silence was heavier. There were answers here, Hank was sure of it. He just prayed they would find them before this killer struck again. Motive: revenge or random violence? As the initial shock of the massacre gave way to the focused work of investigation, one question loomed large over every officer, every forensic scientist, and every resident of Willow Creek. Why? Why the Larson family? Why with such brutality? And most chillingly, why here, in a place where crime was so rare that Sheriff Tom McAllister often joked he spent more time on lost dogs than anything else? Theories began forming almost as quickly as the bodies were discovered. In the first hours and days, two primary paths emerged. Either this was a calculated act of vengeance, or it was a horrific act of random violence. Both options were equally terrifying. Revenge suggested a person who might still be in their midst, someone intimately connected to the Larsons, someone who could easily blend back into the community. Random violence, on the other hand, suggested an outside force, a drifter, a stranger passing through, someone who could strike again anywhere, at any time. The investigators divided into two teams. One was tasked with digging into every detail of the Larsons' lives. If this was revenge, there had to be a reason, a spark that ignited this inferno of rage. The other team turned its focus outward, combing nearby counties, state databases, and federal records for any similar cases or individuals with histories of extreme violence who might match the modus operandi witnessed here. The Larsons were, on the surface, the image of the American dream, a tightly knit family who had built their lives in Willow Creek over generations. James Larson, the father, ran the town's hardware store with a reputation for kindness and a willingness to lend a hand even when a customer couldn't pay up front. Margaret, his wife, was beloved in the community for her cheerful demeanor and her involvement in every church and school event imaginable. Their children, too, seemed to epitomize innocence. Cassidy, the eldest, was a high school cheerleader with good grades and big dreams for college. Dylan, the middle child, loved baseball and piano, and youngest Timmy was a curious, wide-eyed 7-year-old who charmed everyone with his mischievous grin. At first glance, it seemed impossible that anyone could harbor such hatred for a family so universally liked. But as the investigators began to peel back the layers of this picture-perfect image, they found cracks, small, almost imperceptible, but potentially meaningful. James had once been involved in a serious property dispute with Lee Harris, a neighbor whose farmland bordered the Larsons' property. The argument, years ago, had nearly gone to court before the Larsons seemingly won the dispute. Harris had moved out of town shortly thereafter, selling his farm in what he'd angrily called a forced decision. Though the matter was considered long settled by most townsfolk, Sheriff McAllister couldn't help but recall the bitterness in Harris's words the last time they'd spoken. Could Harris have nursed that grudge for so long, letting it fester until it erupted in violence? Then there was Margaret's work with the church. While most locals admired her tireless efforts to raise funds for community projects, one woman, Janet Colburn, had accused her of overstepping. Janet had complained that Margaret had pushed too aggressively to replace the church choir director, a suggestion that Janet, a longtime choir member, took as an insult. Janet was known for her temper and had an unpleasant habit of escalating small matters into giant grievances, but could she have taken it this far? And then there was Stephen Wilson, Margaret's brother. Though he lived in a different town and wasn't officially a part of their household, some wondered if trouble in his life might have spilled over into theirs. As a former police officer, Stephen had been involved in a controversial arrest of a man named Aaron Lockwood 8 years prior. Lockwood had been convicted and sent to prison on a litany of charges, with Stephen's testimony playing a key role in the trial. Sources revealed that Lockwood's family had publicly blamed Stephen, claiming he manipulated evidence. The Lockwoods had all but vanished after the trial, but detectives wondered, could they, or someone connected to them, have sought revenge by targeting Stephen's closest family? Of course, these leads were overshadowed by another terrifying possibility: that none of it mattered. Maybe James and his family weren't chosen because of grudges or vendettas. Maybe they were chosen simply because they were there. The crime scene suggested some level of intent. The killer, or killers, had entered the home without force, likely indicating that the family had let them in willingly. This pointed to possible familiarity. but the sheer viciousness of the attack, the way every member of the family was systematically executed, added a layer of chaos and madness that didn't easily align with someone who was merely acting on a decades-old grudge. Dr. Emily Brandt, a criminal profiler called in by the neighboring county, explained to the team what she called the threshold theory when it came to killers. There are those who plan carefully and leave minimal damage outside of their intended scope, she said. And then there are those who, once they cross the line into violence, unleash everything. The brutality at the Larson home suggests the latter. Revenge can be meticulous, but this was hatred. The theory of a random killer gained more traction when investigators found new footprints near the forest that led away from the farm. Size 12 boots, covered in mud distinct from the soil around the household, raised the possibility that the assailant wasn't from Willow Creek at all. But if they were an outsider, how had they chosen this family out of all the ones nestled in this rural community? "We need to consider the unthinkable," Sheriff McAllister said at a tense meeting 2 nights after the tragedy. His voice hesitated as if each word resisted leaving his mouth. "Maybe this wasn't just about the Larsons. Maybe someone came here to our town to send a message, any message, and the Larsons were in the wrong place at the wrong time." The idea chilled the room. Random madness was harder to combat than deliberate revenge. If someone had killed the Larsons simply because they could, they might strike again, with another family, in another town. Despite the detective's fears and the profiler's insights, there was one glaring issue that remained unresolved. Emily Larson, the sole survivor, was at the heart of every conversation about motive. What had she seen that night? Was she spared out of mercy or malice? Could the killer have wanted her to spread the emotional terror, or did she simply escape a house that wasn't meant to have any survivors? As the days passed, the once bright and sunny streets of Willow Creek became clouded with suspicion and fear. Neighbors began eyeing each other differently, questioning every interaction they'd had before the killings. Curtains that used to remain open all night now stayed shut. Residents installed deadbolts on their doors without saying a word about it, as though acknowledging aloud that they were afraid would only make the fear stronger. The town waited nervously for answers about the motive behind the massacre. But none would come quickly, and as the days stretched into weeks, the questions morphed from whispers to outright panic. If there was logic to what had happened at the Larson farm, no one in Willow Creek could yet grasp it. If there wasn't, then the darkness that had shattered their sense of safety might not just linger but grow. Potential suspects. As the investigation into the Larson family massacre gained momentum, the focus gradually shifted to narrowing down the list of potential suspects. For a crime of this scale and savagery, there was a nagging sense among the investigators that the killer wasn't just some faceless outsider passing through town. No, it felt too personal. Someone who could inflict such horror on 6 innocent people likely carried a deep grudge, or a dangerous mind. The small town of Willow Creek, once a place where everyone seemed to know each other's secrets, suddenly became unsettlingly opaque. Faces that once exchanged warm greetings now felt like masks hiding far darker truths. Was it possible the killer was someone from the community, or was it an act of violence ushered in from the outside world, as unthinkable as the tragedy itself? Detectives began to cast a wide net. Every neighbor, every acquaintance, and every passing stranger was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. From this, a few names began to stand out. People with motives, however vague or buried, who could not be immediately ruled out. 1. Lee Harris, the angry ex-neighbor. Lee Harris was the first name that came up when whispers of suspicion spread across town. Once a lifelong resident of Willow Creek, Lee had lived just a stone's throw away from the Larsons before abruptly moving out 5 years ago. His departure wasn't marked by fond farewells, but rather by visible resentment. The source of that bitterness? A bitter property line dispute with James Larson. The Harris and Larson properties had bordered each other for decades, with an old barbed wire fence dividing the farmland. But Lee Harris had always claimed a significant portion of what was marked as Larson property actually belonged to him. That land was stolen, he reportedly told anyone who would listen, though the dispute was settled in favor of the Larsons, after local surveyors backed James's claims. According to rumors, Lee hadn't taken the loss graciously. After losing his case, he sold his land and left town, but not before holding a drunken rant outside the hardware store during which he swore revenge. At the time, nobody thought he truly meant it. Lee's just blowing off steam, people had said. But as the detectives revisited old records and memories, suddenly, his threats seemed to hold more weight. Word reached the authorities that Lee had recently been seen in neighboring counties, working odd jobs and living out of motels. Detectives tracked him down in a dingy trailer park 2 hours away. He looked rougher, older, but his fury hadn't dimmed. "I didn't have anything to do with those damn Larsons," he spat when questioned. "But if you want someone to blame, maybe don't look at an old man trying to get by. Look closer to home. Maybe that cozy little family wasn't as golden as you all think." He denied involvement, but his continued anger only made him a stronger suspect. Blood tests and fingerprints were taken, though no immediate links between him and the crime scene were found. Yet as far as motives went, Lee had one: revenge. 2. Janet Colburn, the church choir adversary. Then there was Janet Colburn, a longtime resident who had clashed with Margaret Larson on more than one occasion over church matters. Janet, a stern woman known for her fiery temper, had often butted heads with Margaret's more modern and inclusive approach to the town's religious activities. The most notable source of conflict arose from the church choir. Margaret had frequently pushed for changes, including replacing the choir director Janet had staunchly defended. Margaret wanted new voices and fresh energy, phrases Janet saw as veiled insults toward her and the older women who'd sung in the choir for decades. Publicly, their disagreement seemed civil, but locals whispered that Janet harbored a deep resentment toward Margaret. "She thought Margaret was taking over everything," said Betty Cramwell at the diner. "Wanted to run the choir, the bake sales, the church fundraisers. Everything Margaret touched, Janet felt like she was being pushed out." Detectives interviewed Janet, who vehemently denied having any issues with Margaret or her family, but her nervous demeanor, coupled with vague, almost evasive answers, raised eyebrows. When detectives asked where she had been on the night of the murders, she claimed to have been at home, alone, watching television. "Why on earth would I want to hurt Margaret or those kids?" she snapped. "This whole town is losing its mind if they think I'd have anything to do with that." While Janet's grudge didn't seem violent enough to warrant murder, investigators couldn't ignore her years of friction with Margaret. Was it impossible that pent-up bitterness over being overshadowed had finally exploded into something unthinkable? 3. The drifter at the motel. Not all eyes were on those close to the Larsons. A lead emerged about a suspicious drifter who had checked into the nearby roadside comfort motel 2 weeks earlier. Employees described him as odd and fidgety, with a habit of loitering at local diners but never speaking to anyone. The drifter, identified as Wayne Crowley, was a man with a criminal record that ranged from petty theft to assault. What concerned detectives more was the timing of his departure. He checked out the morning after the murders, leaving behind a room littered with cigarette butts and an empty liquor bottle. The motel owner recalled overhearing Crowley talk to himself in hushed, erratic tones. "It gave me chills," she said. "He kept saying something like, 'It's in the blood, and gotta clean them out.'" While this could have just been the mutterings of an unstable mind, the eerie phrasing was enough to warrant a closer look. Detectives tracked Crowley to another town, where he had been arrested for shoplifting at a gas station. When questioned about the Larsons, he was defensive but ultimately insisted he had nothing to do with the killings. "I didn't kill nobody," he said with an unsteady laugh. "I got my demons sure, but they ain't gonna send me to hell for somebody else's sins." His alibi, a vague claim that he had been drinking under a bridge near the interstate, was hardly airtight, and his unsettling behavior remained on investigators' radar. 4. Jack Coleman, the ex-Marine. And then there was Jack Coleman, a name that brought a chill to even the most seasoned investigators. Jack, a former Marine who had returned to Willow Creek after serving overseas, was known around town for his increasingly erratic behavior. Jack suffered from severe PTSD and had developed a reputation for violent outbursts. Residents told stories of seeing him pacing up and down the streets late at night, muttering to himself, or sitting alone at the local park for hours, his hands trembling as if caught in invisible internal battles. But it was his connection to Stephen Wilson, Margaret's brother, that drew investigators' immediate attention. Jack had served under Stephen during his police officer days, working security for county events. Jack was fired after an incident where he lashed out at a bystander without provocation. People whispered that Jack had held a grudge against Stephen ever since. Could Jack's simmering feelings of betrayal have erupted in targeting Stephen's family instead? His alibi was murky at best. He claimed to have been home all night nursing a bottle of bourbon. No witnesses could verify it, and the signs of increasing instability painted a picture of someone capable of unpredictable violence. The growing tension. As these names swirled around the investigative offices and the coffee shops and living rooms of Willow Creek, The fabric of the community began to fray. Neighbors looked warily at each other during Sunday service. The grocery store aisles were filled less with friendly chatter and more with long, uncomfortable silences. The Larsons had once symbolized everything good in Willow Creek, but now, their deaths cast a long, dark shadow, making everyone wonder if the killer was someone who had walked among them all along. Law enforcement connections and lingering doubts. The tragedy at the Larson family farmhouse sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community of Willow Creek, but the investigation also pulled at threads that led far beyond the town's borders. While investigators painstakingly combed through evidence, one connection kept surfacing, a connection tied to a man who wasn't even in the house that night. Stephen Wilson, Margaret Larson's brother, and a former police officer, quickly became a name that shadowed every conversation around motive. Could trouble from Stephen's past have come knocking on the door of his family in the form of brutal revenge? Stephen Wilson had been a celebrated officer during his years of service. Known for his meticulous dedication and strong sense of justice, he was the kind of cop who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty if it meant doing the right thing. To the outside world, his badge symbolized honor. Within the force, though, he was regarded as a polarizing figure. He had exposed more than one unethical colleague, actions that earned him the admiration of some but planted seeds of ire and resentment in others. During his tenure in law enforcement, Stephen worked on some of the county's most high-profile and controversial cases. One such case involved Aaron Lockwood, a known drug trafficker and gang affiliate from a neighboring county. Stephen had played a pivotal role in Lockwood's arrest nearly a decade ago. At the time, Lockwood's influence stretched into the darkest corners of the communities surrounding Willow Creek. A shrewd and violent operator, he had run elaborate drug rings while maintaining a terrifying reputation for silencing those who dared cross him. Stephen's testimony during Lockwood's trial had been key to his conviction. For weeks leading up to the court date, Stephen and his family had lived under added police surveillance because of direct threats made against him. Lockwood's family had loudly accused Stephen of mishandling evidence during the investigation, though their claims were never substantiated. "He's a liar! He set my boy up!" One of Lockwood's relatives had screamed at reporters outside the courthouse while Lockwood was dragged away in cuffs. Lockwood was sentenced to 30 years in prison. It appeared justice had been served. But the storm brewing within Lockwood's circle didn't dissipate. It went underground, waiting, festering. Investigators working the Larson case turned their attention to this volatile history. Lockwood's family may have faded from public attention, but they hadn't disappeared. In the months before Lockwood's arrest, Stephen had received several threatening letters laced with venomous promises of retaliation. While none of them had ever materialized into direct harm, they left scars on Stephen's sense of safety. One cryptic letter he kept from that period read, "You took one of ours, so we'll take all of yours." At the time, Stephen had dismissed it as empty rage from a desperate family. Now, with his sister's family slaughtered, those words took on an ominously prophetic tone. When detectives brought Stephen in for a formal interview, he sat rigid in the chair, his eyes betraying the weight of his past decisions. "Do you believe this has something to do with Lockwood?" one investigator asked directly. Stephen rubbed his temples, visibly distressed, before answering. "I don't know," Stephen replied. His voice was gravelly and low, clouded with self-blame. I thought that part of my life was over. After the sentencing, I left the force because I couldn't deal with the enemies it created. But if someone's come back to settle old scores, how the hell could I have let this happen to Margaret?" His hands trembled as he spoke. The theory wasn't far-fetched. Lockwood's family had relocated shortly after the trial, but their connections through a network of gang affiliates remained strong. Detectives wondered, could someone loyal to Lockwood have come for Stephen's family as a proxy for revenge? And if so, why now, nearly a decade later? Lockwood was still locked away in prison, but as one profiler noted, gang loyalty doesn't fade with time, and the angrier they get, the more patient they become. Adding more fuel to the fire of suspicion, Stephen's abrupt resignation from law enforcement years back raised eyebrows. He had left 2 months after receiving a commendation for bravery during a hostage rescue, a seemingly odd time to step away from his career. When one detective pressed him on it, Stephen grew defensive. "I'd had enough," he said firmly. "The job takes everything from you. At some point you have to choose if you want to save strangers or your own family. I chose my family." But the ripple effects of his work didn't end when he turned in his badge. Former colleagues came forward with mixed accounts of Stephen's time on the force. Most described him as moral and diligent, but a few suggested he'd made enemies within their own ranks, not just because of Lockwood, but because Stephen had been vocal against what he called internal corruption. Old grievances and festering grudges within law enforcement itself raised an unsettling possibility. Could the killer have been targeting Stephen because of someone he'd alienated on the job? Even more intriguing was the fact that Stephen had stayed silent about the threats he'd received before Lockwood's trial. His colleagues claimed he refused to escalate the matter out of pride or a belief in his own ability to handle it. But that silence now felt deafening. One peculiar discovery particularly rattled the detectives. A letter was found in Margaret Larson's desk drawer, dated 2 months before the murders. Scrawled in all caps, it read, "You're not safe from what your brother did." The letter bore no return address, and forensic tests didn't yield any usable fingerprints. Margaret had filed no official police complaints about such threats, leading investigators to conclude she might have dismissed it as a prank, or worse, intentionally chose not to worry her family. Adding to the complications was the possibility that Stephen himself wasn't entirely forthcoming with what he knew. "Do you think Stephen is hiding something?" one of the lead detectives, Carl Hastings, asked Sheriff McAllister one morning over coffee. Sheriff McAllister shook his head slowly, though doubt lingered behind his eyes. "I've known Stephen my whole career," Tom replied. "He's not the type to get people hurt, but the ghosts of our past have a funny way of sticking closer than we think." Stephen's involvement, or at least his connection to possible motives, created a divide within the investigative team. Half believed Stephen was as much a victim as his late sister's family, blindsided by long-buried grudges resurfacing with unthinkable cruelty. The other half wasn't so sure. They saw too many gaps in his story, too many details that looked conveniently forgotten. While law enforcement unraveled the threads of Stephen's professional and personal history, the townsfolk had no such restraint in their speculation. Whispered conversations at the diner grew louder. Neighbors began questioning why Stephen had stayed in the shadows since the massacre, and some suggested outright that those cop skeletons from his past had destroyed an innocent family. "Stephen was supposed to protect them, wasn't he?" one woman muttered bitterly under her breath at the grocery store. "And Stephen himself?" He remained withdrawn, answering what questions he had to, but retreating into himself more and more each day. "I don't need therapy," he told one colleague who suggested counseling, a statement intended to sound resolute but carried a mournful finality. On the rare occasions he appeared in public, Stephen's face was a mask of grief, blank and drained of the righteous purpose he had once carried in his police days. If Stephen Wilson truly held the key to the question of why, the detectives feared it might only emerge too late, when the killer had already planned their next move. Evidence at the scene. The crime scene at the Larson farmhouse was more than just a grisly stage of unimaginable violence. It was a puzzle. A web of cryptic details and eerie anomalies begging to be unraveled. Every speck of blood, every scuff on the floor, every misplaced object told a fragment of the story, a dark, fragmented narrative that the investigators had to piece together. From the moment law enforcement had crossed the threshold of what had once been a family home, starkly transformed into a house of horrors, it was clear that the clues left behind weren't going to make their job any easier. The bloody footprints. One of the most striking pieces of evidence found at the scene of the massacre were the footprints. Trails of blood-soaked prints stretched from the downstairs living room all the way to the staircase and then out through the back door. But what drew immediate attention wasn't merely the fact that they existed, it was their inconsistency. Some footprints were small and light, possibly belonging to one of the victims, likely Timmy, the youngest child, who investigators suspected may have tried to run upstairs in fear. Others were larger, heavier, and muddied, as if someone had walked through the grime of the surrounding woods before tracking it inside. These sets didn't match. Oddly enough, the larger footprints, all made by a size 12 boot, were erratic. They led in circular patterns through different rooms before abruptly stopping near the back door. Officers noted that a faint trail of smudged blood continued toward the forest that bordered the Larson property. The prints abruptly disappeared less than 20 yards into the woods, as though whoever made them had deliberately taken steps to mask their tracks. "Why stop here?" Deputy Hank Watterson muttered to himself, as he crouched over the last visible mark in the underbrush. Was this where the killer had slipped away into the thick cover of trees? Had they been picked up by a vehicle waiting nearby? Or, as a darker thought troubled him, had someone been lying in wait outside that very home long before the murder started? The boot. The footwear trail also spurred new questions when a discarded boot was uncovered several hours later. It lay near the Larsons' barn, obscured by tall grass and tossed as though discarded in haste. The interior of the boot was damp with sweat, and dried blood smudged the sole. Forensics immediately worked to analyze its origin. The size 12 boot wasn't designer or particularly unique. It was a generic, mass-produced model, offered at countless local outlets, truck stops, and department stores. However, fragments of soil and debris caked into the tread revealed a vital clue. The mud wasn't native to the Larson property. It was too clay-heavy, with traces of mineral deposits only found in quarries located several miles to the north. Whoever had worn the boot had recently been moving near those sites. The mysterious glove. Near the back kitchen window of the Larson house, officers discovered another anomaly, a single black leather glove. The glove, smeared with drying streaks of maroon, had been dropped just inches from the window ledge. Initially dismissed as an accidental discard by first responders, or even one of the investigators themselves, sharper eyes thought otherwise. The material was damp, indicating it had been out under the elements for hours. Furthermore, fibers embedded inside the glove revealed it had been worn by someone that night, perhaps pulled off swiftly as they slipped out the back to escape. This lone glove raised chilling questions, especially when its serial number traced it to a brand distributed exclusively through Army surplus stores. Was it a coincidence? Had the glove belonged to someone capable and trained, or had it only been used that night as a tool of mere convenience? The scratched floorboards. In the center of the living room, just beside the body of Margaret Larson, detectives found strange scratch-like indentations in the floorboards. These markings didn't seem to align with the natural chaos of the attack, nor were they purposeful enough to be dismissed as casual wear and tear. Circular gouges in the soft pine wood gave the impression that something metallic and heavy had been dragged across the floor. Carl Hastings, the lead forensic investigator, squatted below the nearest floor lamp to examine the scratches more closely. "What the hell were they doing here?" he whispered, brushing a gloved hand along the uneven patterns. It was as if someone had moved or adjusted a large circular object, a piece of furniture perhaps, though none of the furnishings in the house looked recently displaced. Adding to the mystery was the unnerving presence of charred residue embedded into some of the gouges. Tests later revealed these smudges contained traces of flammable chemicals, though there had been no fire damage anywhere else in the home. Had the killer's intentions gone beyond murder? Was there an abandoned plan to burn the house down or destroy evidence? Or was this something even darker, hidden beneath the surface of an already horrifying crime? The clock stopped at 2:13 a.m. Perhaps the most haunting discovery of all was the family's antique grandfather clock standing tall in the main hallway. Its hands were frozen at exactly 2:13 a.m., the ornate glass face smeared with blood. The clock had been struck violently, its inner mechanism shattered, but whether it had broken incidental to the struggle or been intentionally stopped remained unclear. Some investigators speculated the killer had purposely smashed the clock, leaving behind the chilling timestamp as an eerie message, or potentially even signing their work. Others debated whether it simply froze during the chaos, marking the exact moment the Larson family's world came to its cataclysmic end. For Emily Larson, the sole survivor, the sight of the broken clock would later become a symbol of the frozen horror of that night, a night that her mind refused to release no matter how much she wanted it to. The weapon that wasn't found. One detail nagged at Sheriff McAllister from the moment he arrived at the scene: the missing weapon. The sheer brutality of the killings made it clear that this was no crime of passion committed with household items in the heat of the moment. The deep, precise cuts on each victim's body pointed toward a weapon with an edge meant for efficiency, likely a hunting or combat knife. But despite exhaustive searches in and around the property, not a single weapon was recovered. The absence of the weapon suggested intentional planning. The perpetrator hadn't simply acted impulsively. They had brought the right tools, done their work, and left just as meticulously as they had entered. "Who does this and leaves nothing behind?" McAllister muttered during one of their nightly debriefs. "Well," Carl responded grimly, "whoever it is didn't just want them dead, they wanted them shredded." An uneasy puzzle. Even with days of sifting through evidence, detectives and forensic teams were left with more questions than answers. Each piece of evidence pointed in different directions, and none of it seemed to fit into a single cohesive narrative. Was the glove connected to the boots? Were the scratches a sign of an abandoned plan, or pure chaos? Why were the footprints so erratic, and why did they vanish so conveniently after just a few yards? Every passing day only deepened the eeriness surrounding the farmhouse. To the townsfolk of Willow Creek, the house morphed into something symbolic, more than just a place where evil had struck. It became a labyrinth of dread, where every blood-streaked wall and overturned table felt like it carried a secret the investigators simply couldn't uncover. For Sheriff McAllister and his team, the weight of those questions pressed down like the icy November winds sweeping through the fields outside the Larson home. Answers were critical. They needed them not just to bring justice, but to protect a town coming apart at the seams. Because in the absence of answers, one terrifying possibility loomed larger with every silent, sleepless night. That the killer, whoever they were, wasn't done yet. The shocking revelation of the killer. It was a cold Friday evening when the case took an unexpected, electrifying turn. After weeks of dead-end leads and mounting tension, the police and townsfolk alike had nearly resigned themselves to the grim likelihood that the Larson family's killer might never be found. But then, a single phone call to the sheriff's office shattered the quiet despair that had begun to settle over Willow Creek. Deputy Hank Watterson answered the call, expecting the usual tips from well-meaning but panicked locals who suspected their neighbors, their relatives, or even the occasional delivery driver of the unthinkable. But the breathless voice on the other end wasn't offering a simple tip, it was a confession. "You looking for who killed them Larsons? That was me, all right." The voice sneered, jittery and cracked, as if it belonged to a man teetering on the edge of oblivion. "You're wasting your time chasing dogs that don't bark. I did what I had to do, and I'm not sorry for it." Hank froze, his hand tightening around the phone, heart hammering as disbelief and dread coiled in his gut. The voice belonged to Jack Coleman, a decorated former Marine and Iraq War veteran now infamous around town as the disgraced security guard turned recluse. Jack had lived on the outskirts of Willow Creek for years, in a weather-beaten cabin at the edge of the woods, shaking off the world and its prying eyes. Now, out of nowhere, he was claiming responsibility for the Larsons' brutal slaughter. As Hank struggled to collect his voice, Jack abruptly ended the call. "Tell McAllister to come get me himself if he's still got the stones." The line went dead. Pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The revelation sent shockwaves through the sheriff's department. Jack Coleman had always lingered on the fringes of suspicion, his erratic behavior and well-documented outbursts making him a natural subject of gossip around town. But until now, there had been no evidence tying him to the crime scene. Sheriff McAllister, his jaw set and voice tense, led a team of deputies to Jack's property that night. Floodlights bathed the cabin's dimly lit front porch as McAllister and his men approached with weapons drawn. Jack, to their surprise, didn't resist. He stood in the doorway, illuminated by the flickering light of a single bare bulb hanging above him. Rolling up his sleeves, he revealed a forearm still marked with deep scratches that looked suspiciously like defensive wounds. "Came to dance, huh?" Jack said with a crooked smile. "Too bad it's already over." Inside Jack's cabin, they found a small arsenal of weapons, rifles, pistols, hunting knives, none of which directly matched the weapon used in the Larson murders. But tucked away inside a wooden trunk at the foot of his bed, investigators found what could only be described as a makeshift shrine. Photographs of the Larson family torn from local newspapers, a faded military medal stained with something that resembled blood, and a journal with pages full of scrawled rantings. Words like betrayal, justice, and purification littered the entries, scratched so hard into the paper that they were visible even on the reverse sides of the sheets. The most damning piece of evidence was found at the very bottom of the trunk, a blood-stained combat knife. Lab results would later confirm it was the murder weapon. A deeply broken man. As news of Jack Coleman's arrest spread, the townspeople of Willow Creek were both horrified and mystified. What could have driven a man like Jack, decorated in combat and once respected by many, to commit such an atrocity? As reporters descended on the town, old rumors and speculation about Jack's troubled mind began to circulate with increasing fervor. Jack had returned from overseas almost a decade prior, a different man than the town had remembered. Neighbors told stories about his sleepless nights, the way he'd wander the woods near his cabin talking to himself, or the explosive fits of rage that erupted whenever someone startled him. He was a man haunted not only by what he'd seen on the battlefield but by what he'd done there. During his confession to law enforcement, Jack described his dreams, or as he called them, his visions. "They came back with me from the desert," he said in a flat, almost detached tone. "They showed me the filth of the world, the ones I killed over there. They whispered to me, told me I had to finish the job back here, cleanse it, set it right. For months leading up to the murders, Jack had been fixated on the Larson family. His paranoia told him they weren't as perfect as they seemed, that they were symbols of a town rotting from the inside. But it wasn't just random obsession fueling his hatred. Jack had a personal vendetta. Years earlier, Jack had worked as a security guard at town events, a job overseen by Stephen Wilson, Margaret Larson's brother. During a 4th of July parade, a drunken incident involving Jack and an unruly attendee had escalated into violence. Stephen, then acting as a senior police officer, had fired Jack on the spot for excessive force. "Humiliated me," Jack spat during questioning. "Told me I had no honor. No honor? After everything I gave for this goddamn country?" Jack's festering grudge against Stephen metastasized over the years, and in his fractured mind, Margaret and the rest of the Larson family became collateral for what he saw as her brother's betrayal. A chilling confession. During his days of interrogation, Jack showed no remorse. On the contrary, he spoke with a chilling calm as he recalled every detail of the killings. "They didn't scream as much as I thought they would," he said at one point, almost conversationally. "The boy, the youngest one, he tried to fight. Brave kid." His demeanor was unsettling. At times he seemed lucid, almost thoughtful. He spoke of the murders as though they were part of some cosmic plan, a duty placed on him by the voices in his head. "I didn't kill them," Jack claimed. "I freed them." The investigators were horrified but morbidly fascinated by Jack's insight into the crime scene, the footprints, the missing knife, the bloodied glove. He answered every question with clinical precision, never faltering as he detailed his timeline for the night of the murders. "You think it was just rage?" he smirked when McAllister accused him of losing control. "That was art. Every cut had a purpose, every second had meaning." The fallout Jack Coleman's arrest didn't bring the relief Willow Creek desperately hoped for. For some, it only deepened the wounds. How had the signs of Jack's deterioration been missed by a community that had prided itself on looking out for one another? Could they have done something, anything, to prevent this? Sheriff McAllister himself struggled with guilt after Jack's arrest. "I should have seen it," he told Deputy Watterson during a late-night conversation at the station. "I should have known how far gone he was." As more details of Jack's mental state surfaced, national conversations about PTSD and the lack of resources for veterans gained new urgency. Jack wasn't just a murderer. He was a man broken by war, abandoned by the systems meant to help him, and left to rot in isolation until his pain exploded into an unspeakable crime. For Emily Larson, the sole survivor, the revelation of Jack as the killer brought no closure, only new nightmares. The man who had destroyed her life wasn't an unfamiliar monster from the dark. He was someone she'd passed in town, someone her father may have once greeted with a handshake. That realization was its own kind of terror, a reminder that sometimes evil isn't lurking in the shadows, it's standing right next to you. The bone-chilling confession. When Jack Coleman was brought into the interrogation room of the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department, the tension in the air was palpable. For weeks the brutal slaying of the Larson family had left more questions than answers, dragging the town into dark speculation and haunting dreams. Now the man who had shattered the small town's peace sat slumped in his chair, hands cuffed loosely in his lap. But it wasn't the cuffs that held him there. It was his gaze, empty, detached, and utterly unbothered by the situation. Sheriff McAllister approached the table, every step heavy as he tried to suppress the rage bubbling beneath his tight-lipped exterior. Jack didn't look up. He fiddled absent-mindedly with the chain connecting his cuffs, as if he had all the time in the world. "You want to tell me what the hell this is about, Jack?" McAllister's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Jack finally tilted his head, his lips curling into an unsettling smirk. "What do you think it's about, Sheriff?" he replied, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Isn't this what you wanted? A name, a face? Well, here I am." His nonchalance set the room on edge. McAllister leaned toward him, the weight of the town's grief and fear pressing on his shoulders. "They were 6 good people, Jack. 6 lives. You killed an entire family, a goddamn 7-year-old boy. You don't seem too broken up about it." Jack shrugged like they were talking about the weather. "Broken? Nah, Sheriff. Broken are these people who walk around pretending they're decent, like that Margaret Larson and her perfect little family." Deputy Hank Watterson, who had been standing by the door, crossed his arms and shot McAllister a look that said, "Stay calm." But McAllister didn't need the reminder. He'd been doing this job too long to lose control even when faced with unrepentant monsters. "You think there's something that excuses what you did?" McAllister pressed, his tone growing icier. "Because if you think for one goddamn second—" Jack cut him off with a short laugh, one so cold it felt like it drained the oxygen from the room. "Excuses?" he said, leaning back in the chair. "Nah, Sheriff, I don't deal in excuses, I deal in truth, and the truth is, I did what needed to be done." The confession wasn't even the shocking part. It was the way Jack described the crime, with an eerie calm, almost as if he were telling a bedtime story to a child who had just asked about the boogeyman. Jack tells his story. "I've been watching them," Jack began, his voice low and steady, "for months, maybe longer. The voices said I'd know the right time, and they were right, they always are." McAllister exchanged a sharp glance with Deputy Watterson. "Voices?" he asked, though there was no disbelief in his tone, just the cautious curiosity of a man trying to understand the abyss before him. Jack nodded, as if this was the most normal detail he could share. "Yeah, voices, you wouldn't hear them, Sheriff. Only people like me get to hear the truth. They came back with me from the desert," he said, referring to his time in Iraq. His tone grew distant, eyes flickering with memories no one could see. "It's funny, ain't it? You go off to fight for your country, you do what they ask, and when you come back, you're the problem. You're what's broken, but the voices—" He turned back to McAllister, his gaze sharp now. "They told me what needed to be fixed." "And the Larsons?" Deputy Watterson asked, breaking his silence. "What needed fixing about them, Jack?" Jack tilted his head again, a sneer twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Margaret Larson," he said slowly, as if savoring the name, sticking her nose where it didn't belong. "Always so perfect. Too perfect. I knew it couldn't be real." He leaned forward now, his chain pulling taut against the table as he narrowed his eyes at McAllister. "And her brother, Stephen Wilson, that smug son of a bitch, thought he could humiliate me and walk away like nothing happened." There it was. The grudge. McAllister's stomach churned. He had always suspected Jack's resentment toward Stephen, but hearing it spelled out like this with such venom was as chilling as it was predictable. "So this was about Stephen?" McAllister asked, keeping his voice level. Jack laughed again, a scratchy, humorless sound. "At first, maybe, but it got bigger than him. It always does. The voices opened my eyes to what I had to do. The Larsons, her and her golden family, they were like rot hiding under fresh paint. I just peeled it back." A night of horror. Jack spoke with clinical detail as he recounted the night of the massacre. "I watched the house for hours," he said, "could see the lights flicking off one by one, and when the clock hit midnight, I made my move." He described slipping into the house through the back door, which was left unlocked, a cruel echo of Willow Creek's trust and peace, now shattered. He spoke about wandering from room to room, his footsteps muffled on the old wooden floors. The way his voice steadied as he described finding James Larson first, the man who had built the family's livelihood in that very house, was terrifying. "He was sitting at the kitchen table," Jack said, tapping his fingers against the metal surface in front of him, mimicking the rhythm of the scene he'd set. "He didn't even hear me coming. One second he's got his coffee, maybe thinking about a new day, and the next, gone." His tone sharpened as he moved on to the others. Margaret by the sink, the children, terrified, huddled together. Jack seemed devoid of emotion, as if he couldn't see the horror in his words. "They screamed some," he admitted, "but not as much as I thought they would. Maybe they knew as soon as they saw me." When he spoke of Cassidy Larson, the eldest daughter, his expression changed briefly. Not sorrow or guilt, but something resembling grim recognition. "She tried to fight me. Not many people do. I respect that." He smiled faintly, then let the thought drop. The details that haunt. As Jack continued, Deputy Watterson fought hard to keep his hand from shaking. The detail in Jack's confession wasn't just horrifying, it was intimate. He remembered the clock stopping at 2:13 a.m., the bloodied glove near the kitchen window, the scratches on the floor in the living room. Every element of the crime scene was accounted for in Jack's version of the night. "They kept slippery, though," Jack said with a shrug. "That little one, Emily, the girl who ran? Fast. Smart enough to get out. Your golden ticket, huh? She remind you every day that I got to them first?" He smiled, shark-like, making both McAllister and Watterson bristle inwardly. Reflections of evil McAllister had interrogated many criminals in his long career, but Jack was unlike any of them. He wasn't trying to bargain. He wasn't trying to justify himself. He seemed proud, not of the act itself but of his role in it, as though he had been chosen to carry out something predestined. "You talk a lot about voices, Jack," McAllister said, breaking the silence that had followed yet another horrific detail. "You ever think maybe those voices are just you? That all this was just you?" Jack's smirk faded, his eyes darkening like clouds before a storm. "You don't get it, Sheriff. You were never supposed to." And with that, Jack leaned back in his chair, appearing more relaxed than a man confessing to 6 brutal murders had any right to be. The chilling aftermath. Jack's confession answered many questions, but it left even more unanswered. The why behind his actions, whether it rooted in his PTSD, his grudge against Stephen Wilson, or the supposed voices in his head, remained an unsettling enigma. For all his openness, Jack never truly let anyone in. For Sheriff McAllister, it became one of the hardest truths he'd ever faced in his career. Sometimes, true evil doesn't need a clear reason. It just exists, festering, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Jack Coleman had struck at the very heart of a town that never saw it coming. The final verdict. Months after the horrifying murders of the Larson family, the legal system finally closed in on Jack Coleman. For the people of Willow Creek, the trial was less a quest for justice and more a desperate confrontation with darkness, a battle to make sense of the senseless. From the moment Jack was arrested, his case had been a media firestorm, with reporters descending upon the small town, eager to plaster his face across every TV screen and newspaper headline. But even amidst the chaos surrounding the trial, one thing remained constant: Jack Coleman's lack of remorse. The courtroom was packed on the day the trial began. Within the town, opinions about Jack ranged from outright hatred to a strange form of morbid pity. It wasn't just that he had committed an atrocity, though that fact was undisputed, but that people couldn't agree on why. Was Jack simply evil? Or was he a deeply broken man let down by a system that had failed him? Regardless of the public debate, for the families of the victims, and Emily Larson, the sole survivor, the case wasn't about understanding Jack. It was about ensuring he would never hurt anyone again. The trial begins. The prosecution painted a devastating picture of Jack Coleman as a cold, calculating killer. They called him a man who thrived on control, domination, and violence. By combing through his journal writings, his military records, and his erratic behavior over the years, they argued that Jack had always been a ticking time bomb. He wasn't just the product of his troubled past. He was someone who had embraced violence as a path to power. The lead prosecutor, Marianne Phillips, stood before the jury in her opening statement, holding up Jack's journal as if it were evidence of a broken moral compass. "This isn't the rambling of a man lost in grief or trauma," she declared. "This is a manifesto, a carefully constructed journey into darkness. He chose the Larson family. He watched them, studied them, and planned their deaths with meticulous precision. This wasn't a single moment of rage. This was premeditated murder." But the defense had a very different story to tell. Jack's lawyer, Robert Klein, attempted to humanize him, portraying him as someone ravaged by PTSD and the trauma of military service. "Jack Coleman is a victim too," Klein argued. "When he came back from Iraq, he was a shell of the person he once was. His mind, his soul, and his moral compass were shattered by what he endured. And instead of receiving the therapy and support he so desperately needed, he was left to fend for himself, isolated and broken. This tragedy didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of failure at every level." To bolster their case, Klein brought in a psychologist who had spent hours evaluating Jack. Dr. Elaine Porter testified about Jack's mental state, describing how his years in the military had rippled into a life overwhelmed by paranoia, delusions, and untreated depression. "Jack Coleman believes he hears voices," Dr. Porter explained to the jury. "He genuinely feels he's guided by forces beyond his control. In his mind, he was fulfilling orders given to him by what he believes are the ghosts of his past. This is not the mindset of a man in control of his actions." The testimony was harrowing, especially for the Larson family's surviving relatives. Margaret Larson's sister, seated near the front of the courtroom, quietly wiped away tears as Dr. Porter spoke. Emily Larson, just 18 years old, sat beside her therapist, her face unreadable, her hands clutching the scarf her mother had once knitted for her. While the town wanted justice, Emily wanted safety, and she wasn't sure the trial would deliver either. The evidence on display. The evidence against Jack was overwhelming. The prosecution brought out crime scene photographs, each one more brutal than the last. The bloodied glove found outside the kitchen window matched Jack's DNA. The size 12 boot left behind in the grass matched his footwear exactly. But most damning of all was the combat knife recovered from his cabin. The same knife that had taken 6 lives in one night. But the evidence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Emily Larson herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the terror of the night. The courtroom was silent as she described hearing muffled footsteps from beyond her door, the creak of the stairs, and the blood-curdling scream that followed. "I didn't see his face," she said, gripping the edges of the witness stand as if trying to anchor herself. "But I remember the way it sounded, the way he moved, like he knew we didn't stand a chance." Her testimony brought many in the room to tears, including members of the jury. Even Jack, who had stared blankly through much of the trial, lowered his head briefly as Emily spoke. Whether he felt genuine regret or was simply uncomfortable with the attention remained unclear. For Emily, however, this wasn't about Jack. It was about finding strength to say aloud what had lived inside her for months. The defense's strategy. Jack's defense leaned heavily on his mental state, arguing that he wasn't capable of forming intent, an essential component of proving first-degree murder. They presented stories from his military service detailing his heroism in high-pressure situations, yet they also highlighted the cracks in his psyche that had appeared over time. They spoke about his erratic outbursts, the nightmares that plagued him, and the isolation he suffered upon returning home. "In war, Jack Coleman was a soldier following orders," Robert Klein said. "In the horrors of his mind, he believed he was doing the same thing. This doesn't absolve him of responsibility for what happened, but it does mean we need to look closely at why he did what he did, and whether he truly understood the consequences of his actions." The prosecution countered quickly. "Insanity doesn't give you precision," Marianne Phillips stated in her closing argument. "Insanity doesn't direct you to cover your tracks, burn evidence, or stalk victims for weeks before striking. Jack Coleman wasn't out of his mind, he was out for revenge, and the Larson family paid the price." The jury deliberates. The trial lasted for 6 gut-wrenching weeks, with the jury deliberating for 3 exhausting days before reaching a verdict. When the 4 persons stood to deliver the decision, the room was tense with anticipation. "On the count of murder in the first degree," the 4-person began, "we find the defendant, Jack Coleman, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some cried tears of relief, while others sat in stunned silence. Emily Larson exhaled deeply, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Jack remained emotionless, almost as if he were watching the proceedings from outside his own body. The sentencing phase followed shortly after, with the state seeking the death penalty. Arguments were made from both sides, but ultimately the jury unanimously agreed. Jack Coleman was sentenced to death, a decision that stirred mixed emotions in Willow Creek. Beyond the verdict. While the legal case had been resolved, the emotional scars remained. For Emily Larson, every shadow in her quiet little town now felt like a threat. For Sheriff McAllister, the sense of failure lingered. He had worked so hard to protect Willow Creek, and yet this unimaginable darkness had slipped through the cracks. The trial also reignited national conversations about the treatment of veterans and the intersection between trauma, mental health, and violence. Jack Coleman's case became a symbol of a systemic failure, how a nation quick to send men and women off to war often failed to heal them when they returned. Yet, amidst the debates and lingering uncertainties, one thing was clear. The Larson family had been failed on every level. And for Willow Creek, moving on would be a long and painful journey. Learning from tragedy. The Larson family murders were more than just the catastrophic loss of a beloved family. They were a collision of all the things a community fears the most: vulnerability, betrayal, and the idea that evil could exist right inside their tight-knit borders. For the town of Willow Creek, it wasn't just unimaginable, it was unthinkable. The tragedy left scars on every life it touched, but from the ashes of unimaginable pain, lessons began to take shape, though they came at a heartbreaking cost. A community broken open Willow Creek had always been the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors, where neighbors exchanged freshly baked pies, and where kids played outside until the porch lights flickered on. But after the Larsons' murders, the bubble burst. Overnight, the community that once prided itself on trust and harmony unraveled into suspicion and uncertainty. People started locking their doors, installing deadbolts, and keeping their children closer to home. The most basic freedoms, the hallmark of small-town life, were now shrouded in fear. Parents worried not just about strangers, but also about the familiar faces in town. Who could be trusted anymore? After all, Jack Coleman had been their neighbor, the quiet Marine who no one thought capable of such darkness. Even the simplest gestures became tense. A smile from a passing stranger now seemed like a possible mask. A wave from a coworker could carry an undetectable malice. "It's like the soul of this town just isn't here anymore," Betty Cramwell, the local diner owner, confessed quietly one afternoon as she absent-mindedly scrubbed a counter that had already been clean. The Larsons' end was a devastating reminder that people can harbor secrets that no one sees. That evil, hidden and quiet, still exists even in the most idyllic of settings. The cost of negligence. Jack Coleman's transformation from a decorated war hero to the town's most notorious killer was a flashpoint for national conversations about mental health, PTSD, and the shortcomings in how veterans are treated after they return home. How does a man go from defending his country to slaughtering 6 innocent people, including children? It's a question the town couldn't answer, and one much larger than Willow Creek itself. Jack returned from Iraq, like so many veterans, deeply scarred by what he'd seen and done. Friends and acquaintances who knew him before his deployment described him as a fierce protector, someone who believed in justice and loyalty, but those qualities were tested and warped by the horrors of war, leaving him a haunted, broken version of himself. "Everyone saw the signs," Sheriff McAllister muttered one night over coffee with Deputy Watterson, both men exhausted after another day of fielding press calls. "The erratic behavior, the outbursts, the isolation, and what did we do? Nothing. We shrugged it off. We said, 'That's just Jack.'" He exhaled deeply. It wasn't just Jack. It was every person like him that this system throws away. Jack had been left to spiral, without therapy, community support, or access to the resources he desperately needed to reintegrate into civilian life. His violent outbursts and paranoid behavior were ignored or excused, written off as quirks instead of cries for help. His struggles were hidden behind closed doors in his isolated cabin, but they grew larger and darker each day, festering into a twisted mix of rage and delusion. The Larsons paid the ultimate price for that negligence. And though Jack sat behind bars after being sentenced to death, many wondered how different the story could have been had someone, anyone, reached Jack before his spiral became irreversible. Emily Larson, a quiet survivor. For Emily Larson, the tragedy wasn't just something she lived through, it was something she carried. Overnight, she became the face of survival and the town's symbol of resilience. People looked at her like she was an answer to a prayer, the miracle among the wreckage. But for Emily, surviving wasn't a life she asked for. Every time Emily walked down Main Street, heads would turn, eyes soft with pity. Friends from high school avoided her, seemingly unsure how to act or what to say to someone who had lived through unspeakable trauma. If she went to the local grocery store with her aunt, people would try to comfort her with phrases like, "You're so strong," or "God must have saved you for a reason." But all Emily could think of was how none of her strength had saved her family that night. Emily withdrew into herself in the months following the trial. She rarely left her aunt's home where she had been living since the murders. Her therapist gently pushed her to talk about her anger, her guilt, her fears, but the nightmares returned no matter how many sessions she went to. "Why me?" she whispered once during one of her rare public statements. "Why couldn't I have gone with them?" The town admired her strength, but Emily didn't feel strong. She was adrift, trying to find a sense of safety in a world that no longer felt like it could guarantee it. The lessons Willow Creek learned. If anything good came from the tragedy, it was that Willow Creek was forced to take a long, hard look at itself. Their idyllic simplicity, the pride of their community, had masked too many problems. 1. The town started investing in mental health programs and creating community resources for veterans. They held fundraisers, opened a counseling center at the library, and even invited psychologists to lead public events about recognizing trauma in others. "If we don't step up," McAllister said at the opening speech for the community center, "this will happen again. Maybe not here, but somewhere, and we'll be partly to blame." 2. For decades, Willow Creek had seen itself as immune to the world's dangers. But Jack Coleman's actions proved that even the safest towns need to prepare for the unthinkable, and to watch out for one another. The cracks in their strong communal structure became glaringly obvious after the murders. In the months after, neighbors started paying closer attention to each other, not as a way of prying, but as a way of ensuring no one was left behind. 3. No tragedy is insurmountable, though it may feel that way. Slowly, Willow Creek began healing. Brick by brick, moment by moment. They honored the Larsons with annual community vigils, where people came together not just to mourn the loss, but to reaffirm their commitment to being better, watching over one another, and never ignoring the signs of someone in need again. Moving forward, through the pain. The Larson murders would forever remain a dark chapter in Willow Creek's history, a cautionary tale burned into the memories of its citizens. But amid the horror, there were glimmers of hope, of people trying to change, to put an end to cycles of neglect and isolation. For Emily it was harder. She would carry her grief wherever she went, a constant companion in a life forever altered. But even Emily, in her quiet moments, began to rebuild. She used her voice, though small and shaky sometimes, to advocate for trauma survivors, and eventually helped launch a scholarship fund in her family's name. "If I can keep one other person from losing everything," she said during its launch ceremony, "then maybe everything we lost won't feel so pointless." Tragedies like these aren't forgotten. They carve their place in history books, in whispered tales among neighbors, in the wary faces of a once carefree community. But they also reflect the undeniable resilience of the human spirit, the ability to face despair and decide to build something better, no matter how broken it started.